Okay. Um, Hello there. My name is Spencer Carney. I'm with the California Social Welfare Archives. I am the Assistant Program Coordinator, and today I'm joined by Elise Johnson.
Thank
Thank you
you,
so
Spencer.
much. And we're going to have a special presentation today. I'm going to get it out of your way and hand it over to you.
Thank you, Spencer. Thank you for organizing this, and welcome to what I call Adventures in the Archives. Adventures in the Archives is a blog and a series of lectures that I'm going to be giving as a volunteer of the California Social Welfare Archives. Um, Today, I will talk a little bit about some social workers from Los Angeles, but ultimately we hope to expand the Adventures in the Archives to reflect the state of California and social welfare across the state. This is me. Let me introduce myself formally. My name is Elise Johnson. I'm a clinical social worker in the Los Angeles area. My day job, I am a mental health crisis and provide crisis mental health in an emergency department. And I also am a part-time social welfare lecturer. I teach at a couple of schools in Los Angeles. And for fun and as part of my passion, I am an amateur historian, particularly interested in social welfare of Los Angeles and social justice movements in Los Angeles. I volunteer for the California Social Welfare Archives. I serve on the executive committee and I co-chair the collections committee. The collections committee has two functions, and one of them is collecting the oral histories of social workers across the state of California. But the other piece of it has to do with the physical archives of the California Social Welfare Archives that are housed at UCLA's, USC's library. And it is one of my most fun things to do is to go to those beautiful library archives and learn what I can about the history of our profession in California. So what I'm going to bring you today and in subsequent presentations are some of the findings that I have stumbled upon or that I knew about and did research on that are found in the California Social Welfare Archives. So without further ado, let me introduce you to a couple of social workers. The objectives of this presentation are to honor social workers from Los Angeles' past, and also to highlight social workers whose work may have been forgotten or minimized, or in some cases, deliberately ignored. I want to include a very honest retrospective of our profession's history and encourage others to research and promote their local areas. But I want to say that I am an amateur historian, and I'm sure there will be errors in my process. I am bringing to you some areas of interest of my own. I hope you like them too. All right, here we go. This presentation is in honor of Black History Month. It reflects service to Los Angeles in particular by many Black folks in Los Angeles. However, today I'm going to talk about just about three. Let me introduce you first to what we call the Hall of Distinction. The Hall of Distinction is a component of the California Social Welfare Archives. And from the inaugural class of 2002, I'd like to introduce you to Biddy Mason, if you're not familiar with her. She was born in 1818 and died in 1891. This is from our website. Biddy Mason, as I mentioned, was part of an inaugural class of social workers in the Hall of Distinction. And of course, she lived prior to the founding of our profession of social work, before there were master's degrees in social work. So it brings me great joy and pride to introduce her, and that this entity, the California Social Welfare Archives, includes Biddy Mason in that process. So as a lecturer to MSW students, conversations about Biddy Mason about some non-MSW students or non-MSW graduates really inspires questions about what is social work and who defines it and once the MSW degree was developed, does that exclude others who are practicing social work from that title? Tell you a little bit about her. So Biddy Mason was brought to Los Angeles in 1851. She was enslaved. She was brought with her 3 children. She was trained and as a nurse and as a midwife, and was, by all accounts, exceptionally skilled. Once she arrived in Southern California, she met a very successful family called the Owens family. They were one of Los Angeles's first founding families and one of the wealthiest Black families in Los Angeles at the time. They alerted her that California was not a slave state and that she was entitled to freedom. And the Owens family assisted her in suing for freedom, which was granted in 1854. There aren't that many photographs of Biddy Mason. You saw one portrait that is established. This image is a photograph taken of the Owens home, and it is believed that Biddy Mason is the woman sitting in the center left of this photo. Once she was free, she continued to work as a nurse and as a midwife, and invested in real estate in Southern California, particularly in the developing downtown, now we would call it historic core of Los Angeles, downtown Los Angeles. And she became very, very wealthy. Eventually, she owned multiple blocks of South Spring Street. So it's south of the Civic Center along Spring Street, and like I said, the historic core of LA. This is a photograph around 1870 of the corner of 4th and Spring. She likely owned this entire block. This is an image kind of from the other direction of 3rd and Hill. This is a building that's very well known, probably not from the exterior. It still exists. It's mostly known as a film site from multiple movies. Blade Runner is probably the most famous one. This is the interior of the famous Bradbury building. She owned that whole block. And I'm just going to show you a little video because Thomas Edison invented the film, and just so happens that he filmed this street in 1898, and this is South Spring Street, and it's likely that all of the buildings that you see at the left of the screen, which is the west, were owned by Biddy Mason. If anybody's curious about where in the world the historic core is, I'll be happy to show you. I'm just going to do a quick little zoom in. So this is Los Angeles, zooming in further. The historic core is actually so south of the 101. This area here is Grant Park. That's really the Civic Center area. And then Biddy Mason's area that she owned is the Bradbury that I just showed you, and that image that I just showed you, as well as this whole area down. This is Mason continued to practice medicine and midwifery at no cost, but began then to embark on some significant philanthropy and what we would now describe as social welfare and social work. For example, she visited those who were incarcerated and provided medical care to them. She opened her home to recent immigrants to LA who were homeless. And there was a big flood in 1880, and she provided funding to the grocer to fill food orders all at her expense. So she essentially fed hundreds and hundreds of people that would otherwise have gone without during a time when the river flooded. She also founded, was a charter member and founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, otherwise known as FAME, She founded it initially in her home. Um, her heirs, which included the Owens and the Mason families. Biddy Mason's daughter married Robert Owen's son, and they continued to provide philanthropy and social services long after she died. In fact, one of Biddy Mason's descendants is a professor at USC School of Social Work. This is a photograph of Robin Cox here in the center with her grandmother. Gladys Mason Owens. For those who might be interested, there's been an ongoing battle to preserve a mural in San Francisco that features Biddy Mason's work as a midwife and a nurse. And I encourage you, if you're ever downtown, to go check out what is known as Biddy Mason Park. Biddy Mason Memorial Park is on the block, one of the blocks that she owned. It is now obviously a bustling commercial district, and it can be found as I have it left on the left side here, kind of the circling the general area of the historic core of Los Angeles, and on the right, probably the most common features people look for is Angel's Flight and Grand Central Market. She owned a building at Grand Central Market. And then behind that, off of Spring Street, Broadway and Spring, is the Bradbury Building that I showed you. And tucked behind the Bradbury Building is Biddy Mason Memorial Park. And I encourage everyone to go get some food at the Grand Central Market and then walk around, and you'll find this beautiful little hidden park tucked behind the Bradbury Building. Over the last 5 or 6 years, there has been a lot more academic interest in researching Biddy Mason's history, and the process of her freedom, as well as academia addressing enslavement in California. And I'll just show you a little website if that's something that anyone might be interested in. This is a website that's hosted by 2 academics that are studying her extensively. It's a great resource if anybody would like to. So there are folks in Los Angeles who have heard of Biddy Mason. She is well known in Los Angeles, but I want to introduce you to 3 other of Los Angeles's Black social workers that you may not have heard of. The first is Georgia Ann Robinson. Georgia Ann Robinson was one of 3 female police officers that were very early female police officers in Los Angeles. They were often considered social workers because of the work they did in addition to police work. So today we're going to focus on Georgia Ann Robinson. She was the first Black female police officer in LAPD in 1919. She was trained as a nurse, which was part of the requirement for women to become police officers. They had to be over a certain age, they'd be married, and they had to have professional training. As I mentioned, because of the role that women were kind of relegated to in the police department at the time, they often had 2 different jobs. They had the job of a police officer, but they also, in all 3 of these cases, founded and ran at least one social service agency here in Los Angeles. In Robinson's case, she founded an organization called the East Side Shelter for Black women and girls. She also founded the Sojourner Truth Home, which is also in the historic South Central Los Angeles area. The building has actually been preserved. It's considered to be one of LA's historic places. And this is what the building looks like now. It's actually the original structure, but it's been it's in obviously it's got restuck out and been changed a little bit, but this is the location. It's right off of Adams Boulevard, not far from US. Unfortunately, during her time as a police officer for LAPD, she was assaulted, and first she lost her right eye's vision and then lost the other eye, and she was fully blinded and had to retire. However, she continued to practice her social work and her political advocacy that she'd done for years, even though she was blind. She was interviewed for Ebony magazine. This is a scan of it. It says, she's quoted as saying, quote, "I have no regrets. I didn't need my eyes any longer. I had seen all there was to see." She became the secretary of Los Angeles' first chapter of the NAACP. Upon retirement, she fought for beach and ocean access for Black Angelenos, including one of the two spots that were somewhat allowed for Black folks in Los Angeles to go to the beach. One of them was called the Ink Spot in San Juan. This is an image of Robinson and her daughter. And this is in Koreatown area, what we now call Koreatown. That's Georgia and Robinson. The next social worker I'd like to introduce you to is named Juanita Ellsworth Miller. She was born in 1904 and died in 1970. She got her master's degree from USC. While she was there, we're not really clear exactly, right after she graduated and started working in social work, she penned a really powerful paper, and it was entitled Treatment of Racial Groups in Social Work. And she took our profession to task and detailed the experiences of a Black social worker and the barriers that were present and the impetus for change within our profession. On graduation of her MSW, she was hired as a coordinator in the Los Angeles Housing Authority. Her role was she was the intake, head of the intake coordination for LA County. She helped develop the Rose Courts housing units, among other ones. So, a photograph of Juanita Miller leading a staff meeting of the Housing Authority. An image of, at the time, the brand new Ramona Gardens housing project. After leading those efforts of establishment of low-income housing in LA, she got a promotion at the Los Angeles Bureau of Public Assistance for several years. Then she was promoted to the State Relief Administration. And ultimately in 1964, she was appointed the Deputy Director of the Department of Social Welfare across the state of California. She was responsible essentially for everything south of, I guess, the Central Coast. So she was responsible for Southern California social services in the early 60s. Juanita Miller was actually photographed quite a bit because in part of her personal life. Juanita Miller was married to a very famous and well-known civil rights attorney, Lauren Miller. So you see here on the left, she's participating in a lot of social events in Los Angeles that benefited the Black community here in LA. So at times, she's often introduced as Lauren Miller's wife, but I think it's really important that she had an incredible career all of her own. I'd like to say that Lauren Miller is Juanita Ellsworth's husband. She was responsible for the founding of multiple Black-centered social service organizations, committees. She chartered multiple organizations. She was a lifetime member of the NAACP. She was a fierce social justice advocate. while working side by side with her husband. Another photograph of some of the most powerful Black women in Los Angeles. There's quite a few celebrities here in this photo, as well as personally, she was very close friends with Langston Hughes, and Langston Hughes and she communicated for years. And there was, upon her death, as her children were cleaning out their garage, there was a treasure trove of correspondence between Langston Hughes and Juanita Miller. All of those papers can be found in the Huntington. The last social worker I'd like to introduce you to is named Opal C. Jones. She was born in 1919 and died in 1998. She has an MSW, and from right after graduation, she began working as a social worker at the Avalon Carter Community Center, which still exists, still in operation. He was tapped. So the Avalon Community Center was opened in 1940. It was a multi-service resources to low-income residents in South Los Angeles. These images are from California. She was hired to be the very first Black female executive director of one of President Johnson's new war on poverty in 1964. The program in particular was called NAP, and it took place in Watts. It was headquartered in Watts, which she headquartered, and it had about 6 or 7 spots all throughout Los Angeles. And the purpose of NAP was to provide training and unemployment opportunities in these different kind of poverty areas described in Los Angeles. She literally hired people as part of her obligation was to hire folks from the community and do some trainings on how to self-advocate as well as pursue resources. So she hired about 200 to 300 Watts residents and trained them to do community organizing, to do data collection about what the needs assessments were in these communities, and they were paid to do this. The problems began the challenge is that many war on poverty projects were designed by white male policy analysts back in Washington, and they were really described as kind of a one-size-fits-all approach all across the country. And so the idea was that whatever would work in one place should be working in other places too. Then the thought didn't really occur to the developers of these war on poverty programs to customize the services to particular neighborhoods and communities. Still the philosophy around hiring local women, particularly Black women, really was limited around gender roles of the day, and they were really trained to pursue what was described as domestic work, and they were kept at a lower level in terms of advancement. They were not ever going to make it up into leadership roles, and Opal Jones's experience reflected that in some ways. She was doing an incredible amount of work, but the structure of the day meant that she was not likely to be advanced into a leadership position in her career. One of the things I always share with my students whenever I'm talking about social justice movements and folks around and the history of social justice movements in Los Angeles, I always ask, what were we doing as social workers? What were we doing during this time? And I'm sorry to say that by the time of the late 50s and early 1960s, the social work profession had essentially abandoned what we would now describe as community organizing. In the 1920s, there were a lot more social workers doing community organizing, and even into the 30s. But the fear over communism and the Red Scare and the Cold War really squelched any meaningful community organizing efforts by social workers, and we really turned to direct service and individual service, and in particular, what we now would describe as clinical social work. And really did not participate in community organizing efforts until really the late 60s or 70s, certainly in Los Angeles, with a couple of exceptions, which I will teach you about at another time. So Opal C. Jones was really developing the methodology of community organizing as we would describe it as today. And I think it's really important to know that in low-income communities of color, not only social workers absent and collaborating with residents to advance their own communities, just the opposite. We as a profession were perceived as extensions of social control efforts. So Jones had some strong opinions about not only the role that Washington, D.C., the architects of the war on poverty were playing and playing out across the country, but specifically, she was a strong critic of white social workers that were coming into what was described as ghetto and telling those residents how to live their lives. So along the way, she trained 300 local residents on how to self-advocate, how to listen that social workers need to be listening to the community and coaching them on how to navigate these really complicated bureaucracies. And then once they were more competent in that, she stood back and encouraged them to advocate for themselves. This approach of encouraging the employees to advocate for themselves was perceived as militant. That was a term that we used very, very frequently. And consequently, she was fired. She did not back down. She continued to do her work, and it was considered insubordination. She was fired for those efforts. Who fired her? His name was actually Joe Maldonado. He was one of the first Latino leaders in this movement. He was one of very, very few Latino leaders in this community. And he was also an MSW. We'll come back to him in just a second. So Knapp, as I've mentioned, was, she had trained 300 leaders throughout the Watts area, and then there were other these areas, they called them kind of poverty zones at the time. And they were, so throughout, whether it was Boyle Heights or Venice, there were other Knapp entities that she was responsible for training. And consequently, she had enormous support from these particular neighborhoods, particularly in the Watts area, as well as middle-class African-Americans who protested and fought her termination. There were some prominent political leaders in LA. If you're from LA, you may be familiar with Augustus Hawkins, mental health clinic in the Watts area. Augustus Hawkins and city council member Thomas Bradley, of course, went on to be the mayor of Los Angeles, fought very hard publicly and in the media for her return to her position. It's an image of one of many images of folks from the Watts area and also throughout the LA area marching in protest of Jones's firing. This garnered national media attention to the situation. I uncovered a really interesting video that I just want to show you really quickly. So as I mentioned, her situation garnered a lot of media attention, as well as the war on poverty in general. And there was a group of journalists that started filming some of these events and some of these meetings. As old school as it gets.
The following program is from NET, the National Educational Television Network.
So this was a...
It's like, what you're doing, I could take. I can take it as an individual, but I can't see my brothers who don't know you, and I know you. They don't know you, and I see them running in the street in your traps. I see them.
So
with Sergeant Shriver as a distant and
there was a, it's hard to imagine by today's standards when everyone has a cell phone, but film crews had to truck in huge, heavy cameras to film things. And there was a film crew that actually filmed one of the meetings that Opal Jones led, and subsequently was there when she was fired.
Yes.
This is Opal Jones.
I was advised and ordered on Friday morning to not have this meeting this morning. And so this is why I've asked you all, because I wanted to be the one to interpret this to you. I wanted to be the one to explain the whole historical background for this and why we wanted to have a community relations conference. So, yes, Dorothy? Well, I would be guilty of insubordination. No, she asked me what would happen, and I said I would be guilty of insubordination.
Anyway, this film is extraordinary because it follows her in real time during all the course of events, including the marches and protests in support of her. There's interviews with her in which she describes in detail her methodology for what we would now describe as macro social work community organizing. It's an extraordinary little film, and I'm very grateful to have kind of stumbled upon it. So what happened? She was actually reinstated because there was so much media attention about this. And she spent her entire career after that as an advocate. In 1971, she was elected president of Los Angeles Federation of Settlements and Neighborhood Centers in tribute of behalf of that program. The man who fired her, Joel Maldonado, was in charge of the development of Head Start, was responsible for what was called the team posts at the time, as well as NAP. It was a huge job, particularly back in the day, for a Latino to have this position. He fired her in reaction to the public that it was gathering, but also because Maldonado believed that the role that these community members were playing were as employees. They were employees. They were employees of the War on Poverty program. They were getting paychecks, and his opinion was that as such, they were to roll out any kind of community services based on what Washington was telling them to do. Opal Jones was telling them just the opposite, that they were to be organizing themselves and that their job was to assess their own needs in their own community. Hence the dispute. Anyway, Joel Maldonado actually later became the faculty at USC School of Social Work. In fact, he was part of the first cohort of the California Social Welfare Hall of Distinction honoree. You'll notice his name right above Biddy Mason's name. While Jones, the rest of her career was really one of obscurity as a direct service social worker, she was honored by members of the Black community, by city council, by local businesses, and other community activists. She wasn't forgotten in her own community, but she certainly did not receive the same kind of honor that Maldonado did. Some clippings from the Social Welfare Archives. Lots of awards from the community itself. Unfortunately, she did not receive those same kind of accolades from the peers of her own profession. But here's the thing. Opal Jones created a methodology for community organizing that is now in every single textbook of macro social work practice. The way in which she developed macro social work organically and from her own work experience and her dedication to communities, directing their own needs assessments, their own solutions, and supporting that journey within communities is now what we are all trained to do. It is literally the gold standard for macro social work practice. Unfortunately, she's not credited for any of it. You'll not find her name in any single textbook, any research paper. She's rarely referenced at all. Most of the work that she did has been claimed by white women. So we've come to the end of my presentation. I'm wondering if there's any questions. Spencer, if you have any questions or no?
Yes, I have so many. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Elise. This was incredible. Oh my goodness. And I loved that you incorporated these film clips because film just has a way of bringing these moments to life, like seeing that footage of Biddy. Like I was like, I've been on that street. Seeing that footage of Opal, just like being in front of that room of people and admitting that, you know, what she's doing in that moment is so vulnerable for her, but yet it's important to her to be there to have that conversation with them and seeing the emotions playing on her face, her resolve, and you know the fear of having to admit insubordination. Incredible. I had chills, and thank you so much for this presentation. Yes, and so I do have some questions.
Okay.
I always think that Black History Month really gives us a huge opportunity to sort of peel back these layers of privilege in these conversations. And, I was really curious about how you had mentioned that even before the MSW as became sort of an industry standard, that there were people practicing social work and social welfare, in the time of Biddy Mason and likely even before. And I just kind of wanted to open up to kind of build upon these questions that I'm asking. I just kind of wanted a reminder of what those things are. Is it a really high bar? Because Biddy had so many hands in different things, philanthropy, specifically working with the homeless, specifically operating people in a medical facilities aid. So I was just kind of curious what like the historical bar is to be considered a social worker.
It's a great question. And typically that bar has been framed around white normativity in terms of immigration, around assimilation and Americanization. And so there is an effort now to really zoom back and to have a really honest discussion about who gets to decide what is social work. Certainly in my classes, we begin with the Tongva. We begin with Native Californians and social norms and social roles. And we center what is typical and normal around the Tongva first, and explore colonialism and the Spaniards in the mission system and how that kind of social welfare is perceived at that time. Certainly later, not much long later, is we see mutual aid by Mexican American communities. And there's a through line, for example, of social welfare tradition that begins in mutual aid models among Mexican Americans in Los Angeles through to the Zoot Suit riots, which is another conversation we'll talk about, and then through the 1960s and the Chicano movement again. So those are all movements that we would define by today's standards as social work movements. Were MSWs involved? Not often, because MSW degrees were typically attained by white middle-class women who did not necessarily step out of that comfort zone. They, in critical race theory, we take a look at that from kind of a different point of view, and in this idea that what was convenient and beneficial to white women was what they fought for. And if by circumstance or by consequence it did benefit people of color or other folks, that will be a consequence of that. But if it benefited white women first, those were the efforts that have made, and the right to vote is a perfect example of that. So we see time and time again in the 1960s in Opal Jones era that there was not collaboration by other MSWs outside the Watts community, and it's really unfortunate that her work and her efforts have been really under noted, and the only research that's been done really about Opal Jones has been done by one historian. And so I would love to help rectify that. I would love to see more research done by social workers honoring folks like Opal Jones.
I wanted to ask, so all these social workers that you mentioned in this presentation, they kind of, Opal Jones kind of came, she just a little bit later, but it seemed to kind of be that like they were all mostly pre-1960s. And I was sort of curious if the civil rights movement sort of played into their later recognition and them not being ignored as much as they were in the time in which they lived, primarily doing this work.
I wish I could say that's the case, but they really have been ignored in our history.
Okay, because you also said that like white women sort of took credit for some of Opal Jones's work. And then you mentioned these white male policy workers giving trouble for Juanita, which led to her, creating this whole document about the barriers for Black social workers. But I know that they are all women. And so just peeling back a half layer of privilege, did Black men experience the same level of scrutiny that these Black female social workers
I'm
did?
sure. They typically were more likely to rise to leadership positions rather than Black women. So they were certainly receiving obviously some accolades in that perspective, but beyond that, I can't really say.
Yeah,
I
it's
picked
huge.
these three women for Black History Month because I didn't, well, Biddy, of course, Biddy, people know about Biddy, but the other three, I think, have just been lost to history. And my
It's
intention
really,
is
it was
to,
crazy when you said that even like the CSWA Hall of Distinction completely just overlooked Opal. That's crazy.
yeah, it's part of the responsibility that we have is to tell an honest truth about our history, even if it's our own organization, especially if it's our own organization.
The it was really interesting to me that you had said that community organizing and activism just completely wasn't even considered part of the social work profession for years, even though, I mean, as an activist myself, I mean, we see that people who are organizing those things, they're advocating for the social welfare of these often overlooked communities. And so as sort of like one of my closing questions, oftentimes, other marginalized communities are standing on the shoulders of people in the Black community. And in Black History Month, we sort of get to see how these members of the Black community have sort of laid the groundwork for a lot of other marginalized communities to receive recognition. They've learned from them and sort of used a lot of their tools to kind of help receive their own recognition over time. What other communities moving forward in the year have just been completely overlooked by the social work profession?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. You mean upcoming episodes of Adventures in the Archives?
Exactly, yes.
So many. Let's see. Starting with the Asian diaspora, so many Asians have been completely ignored in the history of the treatment of Asians and the role that social work played in oppressing, particularly the Japanese community during World War II. Obviously, the Latinx communities, the queer communities, all of those. There's a lot, and the beautiful thing about Los Angeles is that we are probably one of the most diverse cities in the world, and we have communities that my students hail from that were the epicenters of social justice movements. Some had social workers involved and some of them not so much, but I think it's important that we start honoring those communities as part of our educational process as social workers. So stay tuned.
Yes, we're super excited. Thank you so much, Elise, and thank you everyone for joining us today. And I hope you're looking forward to some more future episodes of Adventures in the Archives.
Thank you.
All right, take care.